Okay, I think we should start. So, welcome everybody to the ELSC seminar series. Today we are honored to host Behrens. Tim, I can hear someone did not mute his microphone. So, Tim is a professor for computational neuroscience at the University of Oxford, England. He did his PhD in information engineering in Oxford, and then he did a postdoc with Matthew Rushworth and Professor Heidi Johansson on models for decision making. He received the Blavatnik Award twice and was awarded the Troland Award from the National Academy of Science. Tim research is focused on neuronal computations that control behavior, and his group has shown that neuronal computation structures used to represent physical space are also used to represent abstract concept among his many scientific achievements. Before we start, please make sure that you are all in mute mode. We allow questions during the talk, but there also will be time for questions at the end of the talk. So let's welcome Tim. Tim,
thanks very much for having me. Yeah, it's a pleasure to come to such an amazing institute, albeit virtually. I'd love to come one day in person. So I guess I should share my screen maybe. Let's share this anyway. This talk is in two parts with a few little nibbles at the end as well. It doesn't matter. So the first bit's about theory in mice, and the second bit is about some data in humans. And so the more questions you ask about the first bit, the less likely you are to have to look at human data later. And so I can find out whether people are correct about whether you're interested in human work or not by how many questions you ask about the first half. Good. Okay. So this is what we do in my lab. We worry about these kinds of problems where people have to learn, represent, and make decisions in these kinds of complex worlds. And recently, sorry, I'm just going to try and minimize the people so I can see my screen. Hang on. Yeah, I'm just going to do that. Sorry. Recently, we've been interested in one particular aspect of this problem, which is how do I represent these links, the relationships between objects and events in our world. We've been very influenced by a different kind of relational inference that happens in space. And so imagine you're this mouse running around space trying to find this cheese. The next time you want this cheese, you can take one of two completely different strategies. The first is you could either just repeat the very same actions that you took last time, or the second is that you could use something, you could use your knowledge of how the relationships of space work in order to make an inference based on this structural knowledge of the relationships in space and take the more direct route to the cheese. And you'll notice that I've described path integration in this weird way, this as a structural inference, and you'll find out why I've done that later. Okay, but we know something about how these problems are solved in space, and they're solved by a zoo of cells in the hippocampal formation, most famously these place and grid cells that won the Nobel Prize. But there are many, a buffet of other cells that come along with these. I'll just mention a few here. Each of them tends to get their own Nature paper and its own name. And so object vector cells, border cells, landmark cells, speed cells, etc., etc., etc. There are many of them, and every time you can name one, you can have a free Nature paper. So there's this buffet, and there's, in my view, some absence of real principles to understand how this buffet all fit together or why they emerge. The other thing I wanted to point out quickly is that these grid cells, whilst being in the entorhinal cortex of rodents, are also found in the medial frontal cortex and medial parietal cortex of humans when recorded extracellularly during surgery. Okay, So this is some kind of structural inference in space. How do I get from A to B, generalizing knowledge of the relational structure of space? But we also know that the hippocampus is involved in other kinds of structural inferences. Here's a really famous one. This one's called transitive inference, and it was studied amongst other people, Howard Eichenbaum. And so it works like this. I tell you that A is greater than B, and I tell you that B is greater than C, and that C is greater than D. And then you can guess that A will be greater than C, or A will be greater than D, because you've understood that there's some linear structure underlying the independent relationships that that I've told you. Similarly, if you go on a gym and you see Jane beating up Bob and Bob beating up Alice, you would have a good idea that Jane would be able to beat up Alice. All right, and these kinds of relational transitive inferences also apparently rely on the hippocampal formation. That's true in fMRI, but it's also true, you can see it really clearly in this beautiful paper of Howard's, where he showed that animals after lesions either to the fornix, which removes the frontal input to hippocampus, or to the entorhinal cortex, which removes the sensory input to hippocampus, animals can then perfectly happily make the decisions that they were trained on, the A versus B decisions, but can no longer make those probe decisions, the A versus C, B versus D, etc. Decisions. And that's pretty striking because, in fact, B has been rewarded many more times than D. And so you'd think, oh, wow, well, they should just be able to do it based on reward, but they don't if you make a hippocampal lesion. Okay. And we've also more recently found out that some of these representations that have been described in space might have some there might be some similar relations, representations underlying non-spatial inferences. Again, I'm going to just try and move something on my screen. Zoom does some weird things when you're speaking. Okay, so let's go back and oh, how do I go? Here we go. Yeah, so here's some data from Dmitry Aronov showing in a rodent that's not running on a spatial track, but is instead listening to sounds that are varying in a single linear dimension in terms of their frequency. So it's going boo. You can see place cells in the hippocampus and something that might be grid cells, bumpy cells in entorhinal cortex. And then we have similar kind of time we're working on problems about these kinds of abstract relational things. So this is a representation of a two-dimensional structure, but not two-dimensional space, but two-dimensional bird space. So birds that can vary in terms of the length of their necks or the length of their legs. And there is a wonderful smoke signal of grid cells that Neil Burgess and Christian Doller invented. So you can measure this grid, you can effectively measure grid cells in fMRI. And that smoke signal exists whether you're running around physical space or whether you're moving around this abstract conceptual space, which has very little sensory similarity to moving around physical space. So it looks like some of these representations that exist in the entorhinal cortex and the hippocampus aren't specific to physical navigation. Okay, and I just wanted to have one slide in case we do get onto the human stuff later, which shows just how extreme the relational inferences can get in humans. This is one of my favorite examples. So this is the film Kill Bill, and the order which it is presented to you on the screen. But this is the order that it actually happens to the characters in the story underlying Kill Bill. And because of your ability to understand the relationships between events and the causal structure of events, you can seamlessly follow this story, even though it's presented to you in completely the wrong order. Okay, great. So this is really what this talk is about. Some puzzles. How can this type of relational inferences work? Can the same system solve spatial and non-spatial problems? And why do those cells look like they do? And so those are the questions I'm going to try to answer in at least the first part of this talk. And this work was done mostly by James Whittington on the left, with help from Tim Muller and others. Tim Muller's on the right there, looking puzzled at this point, and won't be so puzzled by the end of the talk, hopefully. Okay, so how do we start thinking about these puzzles? Typically in computational neuroscience, the good way to start thinking about it is by thinking about the structure of the problem that the brain is solving. And so this is the nuts and bolts, the essence of the problem that we think the brain is solving in both spatial and non-spatial relational inferences. Here's a simple version of it. If I tell you that Janice has a brother, Bob, and a child, Alice, then you, because you're clever humans, can immediately tell me many other things about this family. You can tell me all of these other relationships. Effectively, you're able to do something like add up relationships and understand how those relationships themselves relate to each other. So some kind of path integration in an abstract relational space. The second thing is, if you learn that relational structure in one environment, then you can seamlessly transfer it to a new sensory environment and immediately understand how those relationships work in this new family. So you need to generalize this structural relational knowledge across different scenarios. Okay, so I'm going to try to build a little machine that's going to solve that. There'll be a few slightly more technical slides for the more computational people now, but I'll try to summarize it very succinctly at the end for the less computational people, and then show you a bunch of results. It's not going to, for those people who don't like the computational side, this bit won't last long. For those that do, feel free to ask questions and make it last longer. Okay, so we've called this thing the Tolman-Eichenbaum machine for reasons that should be obvious given the long and painful introduction I've just given. This is the problem statement in a nutshell. Given a stream of sensory stimuli and relations like this one, can you see my mouse? Anyway, I'm going to assume you can unless someone interrupts me. So light bulb, right arrow, broomstick, down, etc. Then you have this stream. The question is, what is going to come next? And that seems like that's an impossible problem to solve, unless you've seen many similar problems in the past, like this. Problems maybe of different dimensions, but similar structural, similar underlying structure. And you can abstract this underlying structural or relational knowledge away from the sensory knowledge. And then in a new world, you can tie all of the sensory knowledge back to the structural knowledge and say, okay, it's going to be the light bulb that comes next, because I understand how the relational structure of this world works. So that's effectively the job of this machine, predict what's going to come next. So to do that, we obviously need some kind of representation of this abstract relational structure. And then we need some kind of memory to tie together the abstract relational structural knowledge to this particular example that you're dealing with now. This is my family being placed on a family tree. Okay, cool. So we need to know, for example, who is where in each individual family. So let's start with that memory because it's easy. So this is how people have historically or often modeled memory in hippocampus with a simple Hebbian memory, and it works like this. I put a I activate a connected network with some sensory knowledge, which will make some of the neurons fire. And then I increase the synaptic weights between those neurons that have fired with just a Hebbian rule. And that means that later, if I choose to index that, that network with just a portion of that sensory representation, then it will pattern complete and retrieve the rest of the representation and pull out the sensory knowledge. Okay, so that's a simple Hebbian memory. But that's not quite what we need here, because we're not just trying to pattern complete sensory information. What we're trying to do is tie together relational knowledge with sensory knowledge in memory. And so we need something like this, something which says, this motorbike is Bob's uncle, or this motorbike is here in space, right? That's the kind of knowledge that is remembered in the hippocampal system. Okay, so, but we can do that with just a very small change to that typical Hebbian memory. Instead of having one input, we can have two. Oh, sorry, I was. Let me step back a little bit and remember the order that my slides come in. Okay, so we know how to represent this sensory knowledge. We have no idea how to represent this strange thing up here, this abstract relational knowledge. But for now, just imagine that we know how to represent this thing. Just pretend that we do know how to represent this thing. And if we did, then it would be totally easy to solve this problem, because we could just bind them together in exactly that same kind of Hebbian memory. But instead of the cells being active when you put a sensory representation in, you should only activate the cells that receive inputs from the correct sensory representation and the correct abstract representation. So you get this thing called a conjunctive memory, right? So the cell fires if it gets both inputs. So this thing is effectively going to tie together something we don't know, which is this abstract relational memory, with this thing we do know, which is this sensory representation here. Okay, so if we had that thing working, then it would be great, because
ask a question.
Yep. Sure.
The representation, the abstract representation, is linking two different sensory objects, if I understood correctly. So do you need to present two different objects?
The abstract representation is not. It's like a location. Imagine it's a location. Imagine it's an XY coordinate, right? But the XY coordinate can work in non-Cartesian spaces, right? That's effectively what it is. So effectively, you're thinking of of a coordinate system for non-Cartesian. You're building a coordinate system for non-Cartesian spaces, effectively, and then the hippocampal part of it is just tying sensory stuff to the correct coordinate in those non-Cartesian spaces. Do you understand?
Yeah, great.
So question?
Yeah.
So you can just think about it as another features of this sensory input. Whether it's relational, you already solved the relational problem.
You could think you definitely could think of it as another sensory input once you've learned it, what it should be. However, having this hippocampus between these two things, having this rapid memory between these two things, factorizes it from the sensory input and allows you to learn it really effectively. That's what I'm going to show you. Yeah. So what this is going to do is it's going to say this stuff here, the abstract location, that code is going to generalize over many problems, and these sensory representation are going to generalize over many different problems, but they're not the same problem, right? Because sometimes that you need different sensory things in different places, and having this thing in between it just allows you to rapidly tie together, build a world immediately the first time you see it. And so you can that's what's so powerful about it. You can walk into a new world and immediately learn that new world because you've got these prior representations that are separated from each other that can just be bound together. That's the trick about it. And so effectively sticking this Hebbian rapid learner inside a representational learner gives you this generalization power. Yeah, exactly. And it will also, I'm about to show you, give you a way of learning this abstraction. Yeah. Okay. So was that clear? Sorry, I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe I should just carry on and then it'll become more obvious. Okay. So imagine you had this thing that you knew how this memory worked. Then you could play fun games because you could retrieve what from where. You could just like pattern completing. Now you can pattern complete what from where, or you could pattern complete the other way around. You can pattern complete where from what. Okay, cool. So now the question is, how do I learn this strange abstraction? What does it mean? What are these blue things? These locations in an abstract space. Well, it turns out that knowing we now know from it turns out that knowing what this representation is the same as knowing how to change it when I make a move in this abstract space. I.e., if I know what these weights are, then I can just run simulations and find out what these representations are. And so our job is to learn these weights. But that already, but even that seems like a difficult problem, because no matter how much deep learning you have, you can't train something you don't know from something you don't know. Okay, maybe I couldn't train, okay, these weights from these two things because I don't know what these two blue things are. Except that I now do, because remember, in the last slide, I showed you that if I've got this relational memory, then I can immediately go through this relational memory and make a prediction of what the sensory world should look like. And so this is now a concrete thing, and I can go and check whether this sensory world looks like that. And if it does, then I can update these weights with an error signal, depending on whether I'm correct or incorrect with making this sensory prediction. Okay, so this is how the system's going to work. I'm gonna try to predict what's going to come next, and I'm going to get error signals, and I'm going to train lots of weights, but most importantly, these weights up here that learn this abstract location, this representation of an abstract location. Okay, it also turns out that if you're Bayesian about this, there are a bunch of other errors that you can learn in this network, because you don't only have a sensory error, but you've also got an error between the memory that you predicted and the memory that you actually made. And then you've also got an error between the location that you predicted and the location that you inferred after seeing what was there. Because if you've been somewhere before and you know what that location is, then you can figure out what the location is, and then you can have an error at this level of the hierarchy. And so this is like a classic hierarchical Bayesian problem, and you can solve it with something a bit like a Helmholtz machine, where you have a generative model and an inference model that effectively train each other. So that's how the thing works. For those people who don't know Bayes, you can ignore those last slides and just focus on the making sensory predictions. Okay, so it's worth just stepping back a little bit and thinking, if this is the fundamental properties of the system, then what kind of representations, what are the pressures on learning representations? And I think there are really two kinds of pressures. One is that you need to make very different representations at each location so that you are good at retrieving memories. You want each one, the purpose of these abstract things is to retrieve memories. And so you want neighbors to have different representations so that they can be tied to distinct memories. And the second pressure is whenever you come back to the same place, you need to make the correct representation so you can retrieve the correct memory. And so this system builds into it the objective of learning path integration, because you're never going to predict what's going to come next if you don't know where you are, right? And so we need representations that can path integrate, but nevertheless make neighbors look very different from each other.
Why not sensory input about location?
Sorry, say that again.
Why not sensory input about location?
Why not? Oh, so at this point, I'm trying to learn an abstract representation that will work in any sensory environment, right? And so there is no general sensory. So in any one environment, you can use that trick. You can get sensory input about location, but there is no sensory information that gives you reliable information about location.
Grid cells.
Generally across all environments. Do you see what I mean?
Grid cells.
So so grid cells don't get sensory. So grid cells aren't telling you about the sensory properties of the environment. These will end up being grid cells, by the way. These cells, I'll show
but
you.
You don't need integration.
You don't need integration. So explain why you think you don't need path integration.
You might have input from place cells, from head direction cells, and so on. You don't need the extra path integration aspect.
I see what you mean, but you still need to build the same representation when you're at the same place twice. And so that wouldn't be true of a head direction cell. And in order to get, you could only do that from a place cell after you've seen it, but you're trying to predict what's going to happen. So grid cell's going to have to predict where you are next. And so I don't think I agree with you, even though I think I see what you're saying, right? So a head direction cell obviously won't have a unique code that is always the same whenever you're at the same place, because it cares about the head direction. And so the job of this system is to make the same representation the next time I'm at the same place. That it's a really simple job because it's just trying to retrieve the correct memory.
Tim, so
it's trying to activate it. Yeah.
Hi. Are you assuming that the structure is known in advance, so we can only really work within a given structure, if I understand?
So I'm not assuming that's true in the brain, but I'm assuming for the purpose of understanding what's happening, so this model is definitely at the moment going to be trained only on worlds that have the same structure. Yeah, exactly. And so my question is, what does a location in that structure look like in representational space? Exactly. And so the structures could be different, and it would be easy to imagine a model that also did an inference over structures or tried to compose different structures, that kind of stuff. But at the moment, I'm playing with models that this model knows something about the structure beforehand. I'll show you later on that it can do clever things with factorizing the structure, so it can. Well, I'll show you that later on. But let's assume for now we're learning. The simple scenario is the structures are always the same. The sensory stuff is always different. Exactly. Yeah. Is that clear? Okay. Cool. All right. Okay, so that's the end of the modeling section. We took a bit more than 7 minutes, but not much. Just to reiterate for the people that weren't interested in that section, its job is to predict the next sensory observation. It learns the relational structure of the world so it can address the correct memories. And then this relational structure is abstracted from the sensory input so it can immediately generalize this relational knowledge to new worlds. Okay, and just to try to persuade you that this is a kind of rudimentary model of the hippocampal system, I'm just going to show you that these are the kinds of representations that we're talking about. We're talking about some sensory representations, and then these abstract locations, and then in the hippocampus we have these conjunctive representations that tie the two together. And this is a diagram of the hippocampal system by Howard Eichenbaum, and it shows that effectively in the you have a medial and the lateral stream. The lateral stream you have sensory representations. In the medial stream you have something that he called context, but that's what I'm going to be calling abstract structural representations. And then the hippocampus binds them together. Here you can see this very clear binding in these conjunctive representations, and Howard wrote a lot of papers about these conjunctive hippocampal representations. And so that's effectively the rudimentary, this simplistic idea of how these three types of representations fit together in the functional anatomy of the hippocampal system. Okay, so does it work? That's the fun. And to understand whether it works is just worth, I think, reiterating the kinds of things it is trying to do. And you can understand what it's trying to do easily by looking at this plot. This is an animal or an agent that's taken a very tortuous path through this graph world. And a normal agent wouldn't know anything about, so a normal agent would just know the relationships that it's observed. So it would know that banana is next to this basket and the shirt is next to the banana, but it wouldn't know also that this book is next to the banana because it doesn't understand the relational structure of the world. That means a normal agent would be able to predict the upcoming object roughly as well as the number of transitions it's seen. If it's seen at that transition before, it can predict what's going to happen. If it hasn't seen that transition before, it can't predict what's going to happen, right? But the Tolman-Eichenbaum machine is not like that, because it's going to guess all of the relationships that it has not seen. It's going to guess all these links that it has not seen. And so it can predict what's going to happen next, not as a function of the number of transitions that it's seen, but as a function of the number of sensory elements that it's seen, the number of nodes that it's seen, which is much faster to learn, right? And so this is TEM working, and you can see that it makes the correct prediction as a function of the proportion of nodes that it's visited here, not as a function of the proportion of edges it's visited, which is what you would do if you weren't relying on this abstraction, this structural knowledge, right? So it's much, much faster to understand and make predictions about the world that it's in.
Can I ask a question about that?
Yeah.
Are the directions coded in the model? I mean, going from the toolbox to the banana is the opposite as going from the banana to the toolbox?
No, it has to learn that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Sorry, can I ask?
Okay.
So
yeah,
the input is the world. So you're giving it this matrix, this the form of the matrix as an optional world, or
no,
does it have?
All it sees is the sensory input and the actions. It does not. You never give it. It never sees the graph. It just sees it just predicts the sensory stuff. It just predicts the banana, the shirt, and it just sees the banana, the shirt. It makes the prediction of what the next sensory thing is going to be, and you give it the actions or relations. Yeah, that's it.
And can you see the map it generates? Can you see the abstract information it generates, or does it stay as a hidden variable that you have no access to?
Well, you can ask it to predict what happens. I mean, you could draw the map that it generates, yeah, because you could ask it to predict what's next as it runs around the world. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Cool. All right. Okay, so just to show you that this is not just true of space, this is a linear structure, and you can see it's making the correct inference. This is the first time I ever saw a linear structure, and you can see that it's not making the correct inference at all. But after seeing 20 or so linear structures, it's really good at guessing what's going to happen if I move 3 along or 2 along where I'm going to get to. Okay, same thing for a family tree, it works. Okay, so this machine can learn and generalize the abstract relational structure and apply it to new worlds. So the question is then, what do those blue representations look like when it does that? And let's just start by letting it diffuse randomly in space. So it's just going to randomly diffuse around that, and I'm going to plot you some of the representations inside the machine. And if I let it diffuse randomly in space and look at these blue cells, these abstract representations, then they look like grid cells. Here I've plotted them in hexagons, but the shape of the world doesn't matter. I can plot them in squares as well. I've just been too lazy to get the right figures. It has grid cells of different frequencies, of different phases within a frequency, and it's got band cells. And these look like the kinds of cells that you will record in the medial entorhinal cortex, grid cells and band cells. And so that lets us start thinking of these things as somehow representing the basic 2D transition structure of space. And that kind of argument's been made before by people, including us, but also by including Kim Stackenfeld, Sam Gershman, Nathaniel Dorr, and people like that. If you go and look in the hippocampus of an animal that's just, of a machine that's just running around space, then you see cells like this. You see these because these are the conjunctions between grid cells and sensory cells. So they go and highlight particular peaks of the grid cells. And so they look like place cells. And so because there are little grid cells, there are little place cells. And because there are big grid cells, there are big place cells. And these are look a little bit like the kinds of place cells you see in the hippocampus. So that was all for just randomly diffusing around a graph world. What if we try some tricks like letting TEM behave more like an animal behaves? Because animals don't just randomly diffuse. What if we let it like walking around walls or approaching shiny objects, for example? What kind of representations do we see then? Well, because it likes walking towards objects, it builds representations that predict that it's going to walk towards objects. So it's going to predict that the sensory things at the objects are more likely. And so in order to do so, it builds these cells here. So here's a couple of example cells. This cell is active 3 pixels to the north of this object, but it's also 3 pixels to the north of this object. In fact, any object that the animal likes walking towards gets a representation in this cell 4 pixels to the north of it. And here's another cell that's the same, but here it's 3 pixels to the east. And so these cells are effectively predicting that the animal's going to move towards this object. And they look rather like these cells that the Moses record and call object vector cells. And so what TEM's done is it's factorized the implications of objects from the structure of space so that it can rapidly compose new worlds. And now this gets to the point about whether the structures are the same. Obviously, these structures have the same dimensions, but the structures are not the same. But it's learned to factorize those dimensions away from each other so that it can put the object in a new location, in a new world, and it will immediately build the transition structure so that it knows that it's going to approach that object in the new world. So because this is going back to the other behavior that we imposed on it, it liked running around walls. And the moment you play those kinds of games, it also obviously starts building representations of those walls, because they also allow it to be better at predicting what it's going to see next. And so here are the kinds of cells that we see in TEM, these boundary cells, and those cells are also seen in the entorhinal cortex of rodents. And so again, it's factorized the implications of walls from the structure of space so it can start building new worlds that are more complicated than just simple 2D space. It's starting building a basis representation for what worlds might look like in terms of their possible transition structures. Okay, so that makes us think that this entorhinal zoo with all of these different names for these different cells is really just a big basis set for representing the transitions and rapidly inferring them in new worlds. Okay, I'm just going to show you what's happening a little bit what's happening in the hippocampus in this situation because it's interesting. So this is like one of those object vector cells, but it only activates for certain objects, not other objects. And that's because the hippocampus in TEM has these conjunctions in, and so it's only going to activate if the sensory code and the object vector code are activated at these two different places. So here's one cell that likes these two, here's another cell that likes these two. And that's also true of the equivalent of object vector cells in the rodent hippocampus, right? Here's this landmark, they're called landmark cells, and they're like object vector cells, but they don't generalize across objects. They only fire for certain objects and not others. And if so, you compare that to the entorhinal cells, which generalize across any object. Okay, so throughout this, I've been talking about the entorhinal cortex having this structural knowledge that it can be transferred across multiple different environments. And that's a bit of a puzzle for people who studied hippocampus and remapping in hippocampus, because it's basically thought that there isn't any general knowledge, a generalizable knowledge in the relationship between two different maps in the hippocampus. So there's this phenomenon called global remapping that I'm sure everybody knows about, where it's thought that just because two cells are neighbors in one environment, that tells you nothing about whether they'll also be neighbors in another environment. These two representations are orthogonal to one another. So the correlation structure between place cells in this environment tells you nothing about the correlation structure between place cells in this environment. And that seems puzzling if we're arguing that the hippocampus inherits structural information that is the same across two environments, right? Okay, but if you look in TEM, you actually find something rather similar. You find that these cells here, this cell here is moving down and to the right, and this cell here is moving up and to the right when moving between environments. Also looks like roughly got orthogonal remapping. But in TEM, we understand why that remapping is orthogonal. So you can remember this. It gets these two different worlds will get input from the same structural code, but different sensory codes. So the sensory stuff is different between worlds. And what this means is that even though what this means is that this different sensory representations here will go and pick out different parts of this structural code in the two different worlds. And so let me just show you this graphically. Here's a place cell here in one world and in another world. And TEM basically says that if it's at a peak of this grid cell in one world, then it's probably going to be a different peak of this grid cell in world 2. Do you see what I mean? So this cell appears to be moving randomly when you only look at hippocampus, but if you knew what the relevant grid cell was doing, then it would always move to the same phase of this grid cell, right? So it would move from here to here. If it's at a peak in this location, then it's always going to be a peak in this location. And that constraint is sufficient to retain all of the structural knowledge across different worlds. And so we went and looked for this behavior in simultaneously recorded place and grid cells from Caswell Barry's lab and Neil Burgess's lab. And so the prediction then is that if you look at the peaks, then the grid cell firing at the place field in environment 1 should be correlated with the grid cell firing at the different place field in environment 2. And that's true across these two different data sets. Here, these correlations are about 0.3. So is that a success or a failure? Is 0.3 enough? And the answer is, well, because there are different modules of grid cells that input to different place cells, and because we don't know which grid cell is connected to which place cell, we can kind of make a prediction of what that correlation should look like in our model. And it turns out that 0.3 is about the best that we could expect, correlation that we could expect in our model as well. So this remapping then is not purely random, although it looks that way if you only look at the hippocampal cells. It is constrained by the grid input. Okay, the last thing I wanted to tell you about TEM, it looks like I'm probably not going to get a chance to talk about the human work. The last thing I'm going to tell you about TEM is that we're particularly excited about it because it isn't limited to these spatial problems that people have talked about, where all these cells have been described. It can of course learn arbitrary structural relationships and start representing non-spatial knowledge. And so here's a recent paper that we found lovely because it has an interaction of spatial and non-spatial knowledge. It comes from Tonegawa lab by a guy called Chen Sun, and it's really simple to think about. It's just the question is this mouse has to run around this lap 4 times to get a reward. And obviously it needs some spatial information because it needs to know it's running around the lap, but also it needs some non-spatial information. It has to count, and it needs to, in order to predict when it's going to get a reward, it has to count. And obviously we can set we can run TEM on this same problem. And when we do, TEM says, okay, I need some place cells in the hippocampus because I am trying to predict the immediate sensory thing I'm about to see now. But I also need to build a latent variable. Which knows which lap I'm on, so that I can predict the distant future, what's going to happen in the distant future, so I won't get it wrong when I try to predict the reward. And so it starts building these kinds of cells here that know what lap you're on in the hippocampus. In fact, it builds 3 types of cells in the hippocampus. It has these spatial cells, it has these lap-specific cells, but it also has these counting cells, presumably so it knows how to transition from one lap-specific cell to another. And then if you go and look in Chen Sun's in the hippocampus, as Chen Sun did, you see these exact same types of representation. And in fact, if you look in our paper, you can see not only can we predict the types of cells we can see, but also we can predict how they will remap across environments. Interestingly, these cells remap in space, but they do not remap across laps. So a lap-specific cell will always prefer the same lap next time round, but might move to different places, right? So the spatial cells will move to different places. And so TEM says that is because, okay, the remapping is caused by this conjunction of sensory and relational or abstract information. But obviously, if you're going around the same lap 4 times, the sensory information's always the same as when you get back to the same point in lap. It's this very strange situation where you come round and round, you get the same sensory information each time. And so there's no point remapping. And so the lap cells don't remap. but the sensory cells do. Okay, cool. Which is true in the data and in TEM. That you can find that in the Cell paper. Okay, so fun. So that's what I wanted to say about the model, and I've been going 50 minutes. I've been taking it slowly, so I'm not going to talk about the human replay data. But we're excited by these kinds of modeling ideas because the same principles allow us to start thinking about slightly more complicated behaviors than you can in hand design models. So this same principles allowed you to think about Euclidean geometry, transitive inference, stereotypical behaviors like moving towards objects or running around walls, and then at the end, task state spaces for reinforcement learning. And so those of you that know about the hippocampus, that includes those lap cells, but also those kind of splitter cells and inbound and outbound cells that fire at particular points in mazes, not at particular points in tasks. Those are all that same kind of latent state representation. I'm going to skip a section that I was going to tell you about human replay, but I just wanted to show you one thing. I really wanted to be able to show you this today. I can't because of COVID and because unfortunately we've not been able to record for 8 months. But this is, we have monkeys that can do these really complicated abstract relational inference tasks. Here, this map at the bottom is a map that one of these monkeys has learned. James Butler and Steve Kennelly have trained them. They're navigating around these big relational maps. They've learned in the home cage, and so that's kind of fun. And we also have some rodents that can do these spatial and non-spatial tasks with these complicated transition structures. So hopefully there'll be some more non-human data next time I get a chance to speak to you. Hopefully that would be in person, not over Zoom. That's all I had. That's all I'm going to say, I think, today.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Thank you, Tim. Sorry. So I guess let's move to questions. We have time for questions. So,
and I mean, unless people are particularly keen to hear about abstraction in replay in humans, I could give you another 15-20 minutes if you wanted me to, or I can just stop now.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
I was wondering whether you can answer a question I've had for a while. You train these on square and on triangular maps, I think you mentioned. And I was wondering what the grid cells look like in the square maps, whether they are also triangular grid cells. Because most of our maps, streets and everything is square, and still we have grid cells. Also in nature, there is no clear geometry. So why do we have triangular grid cells?
So there's many arguments for why you have triangular grid cells in general, to do with packing density and efficient coding and that kind of stuff. So I think that in terms of learnt grid cells, so there are now several examples of neural networks that will learn grid cells, and it was always a puzzle when they would learn hexagons and when they would learn squares, and it's a bit of a complicated. We now know the answer to it thanks to a piece of work from Surya Ganguly's lab, who's provided an elegant and clear theory telling us when it will learn hexagons and when it will learn squares. And it happens to be a really technical answer about how much you it turns out that if you look for if you penalize having large weights a lot, then you always get triangles. And we know theoretically why that is the case. So, but that's not, I think, the kind of answer that you want.
Give me a starting point.
The kind of answer that you want, I think, is like, why is it more useful to have triangles? And I think the answer to that in in square worlds is not at all clear to anyone. But the answer to that in real worlds is really clear. In continuous worlds is because you get more and more efficient representation that way.
Thank you.
More questions?
Hi, I had a question. It's possible to...
yeah, hi.
Yeah, it's just, thank you for the great talk. I just wondered, it was really interesting to see the results themselves, but I wonder exactly what you mean when you say TEM cells themselves, like what is it representing? How do you get to these so-called cells?
Oh, yeah, sorry. That's obviously a completely stupid thing for me to have said. So TEM has continuous representations in the form of vectors, and those it has a vector of representations in sensory input. It has vector representations in the abstract layer, and those vectors change from step to step, right? And so each element in those vectors, I'm just calling a cell, right? So in the same way that if you looked at, yeah, exactly. And so in the same way that if you look at deep vision nets, each element of that vector, people say is like a cell. Obviously, there's no cells in yeah, it was just a sleight of words that, yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, thank you.
I was wondering, could you say something about the amount of memory you actually need, the amount of cells you need? Because it seems like you're creating this kind of factorization, so you need a lot of memory to be able to grasp the whole thing together, don't you?
I think the conjunctive nature of hippocampal representations is a puzzle. I think the answer to, so we've done some simulations on this. So I think that hippocampal cells do appear to be conjunctive, and so the moment that you imagine that hippocampal cells are conjunctive, that gives you a memory problem, right? Because you have to have n squared cells to put together two lots of n. However, so it isn't the case. It isn't like you need n squared problems cells to measure n squared memories, right? Because those n things themselves have densely packed representations. And so if you have an efficient representation on each axis, then so imagine two sinusoids, right? So these two sinusoids are going to start activating sometimes the same cell for being here as they will for being here, and then sometimes the same cells will get reused in the conjunctive thing as well. And so you can massively reduce the memory load of a conjunctive representation by optimizing your inputs for that representation. That's definitely true. Nevertheless, it is still the case that having a flexible, reconfigurable conjunctive representation requires more memory than having overlearned representations of the whole thing. That's definitely true. I think that is a problem for anyone thinking about hippocampus. I think there's no question that hippocampal representation is conjunctive. That's its real pride, right? If you think about this situation here, many times you've seen people on Zoom, maybe once before you've seen me talk at a conference or something. But those representations are totally separated in your brain everywhere apart from the hippocampus, right? So you put together the elements of the current world immediately in your hippocampus, right?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Great talk, by the way. I was curious if you thought about implementing them in developmental context and looking at how the ability to generalize develops and maybe weighted and represented in TEM and in pathology models, And I'm specifically thinking about the work from the lab of Nikolai Axmacher about kind of like, well, not competing, but compensational interactions between grid code and yeah, and then maybe place code in Alzheimer's patients. So it's a question, but just going beyond healthy subjects and healthy animals.
The first answer your first question is yes. We have thought we don't know the answers, but we are trying to do the kinds of things that Andrew Sachs and has done. On hierarchical nets, on 10 representations with him to try to understand theories for when the abstractions happen and when you should factorize and when you shouldn't factorize. So we're working with Andrew on that. And we're also trying to record in some of these mice that I showed you at the very end from the very first day of training and ask when the abstractions emerge in training. And so, but that's very much an ongoing project, and I don't have very much to, I don't know very many answers about that now, but I hope to be able to tell you about that in the future. I haven't done any real thinking about Alzheimer's, I'm afraid. I may be wrong about this, but my guess is that cognitive neuroscientists aren't going to be people that solve Alzheimer's disease. I don't know. I might be wrong. Yeah.
Okay, so we have time for one more question.
I have one.
Go
ahead. Thank you for the talk. I'll be glad to hear. I have more general question. I'll be glad to hear what is the motivation and the end goal behind your research. If you can explain it or maybe sharpen it.
Well, I think good question. Yeah, so I started off in the frontal cortex, and I didn't know how to think about it, and so I started thinking about what tasks were, and so because I think the frontal cortex really has to represent ongoing behavior sometime, and people think about cells in weird words like value and action and this kind of stuff, which is not really, I think, what the brain is doing. It's somehow representing the ongoing task and the structure of the ongoing behavior. And so what I would like to be able to do is to be able to formalize kind of what we mean by a task, and then be able to theoretically predict what that should tell us about the representations in frontal cortex and connected brain areas. And I would have liked to have started with frontal cortex, but it was too hard. And so I started with hippocampus and entorhinal cortex recently. And I'm hoping to be able to get more and more abstractions and go further and further up the hierarchy and try to then understand what's going on in frontal cortex. That would be, I think, what I would say is the long-term plan.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Tim, for a very interesting talk. And on behalf of the whole audience, thank you very much.
Thanks very much for inviting me.
And
I'm sorry for going slowly and only getting halfway through it.
That's perfectly okay. So see you everyone next week in the next